Yeah. Okay, I think we're in. Perfect. Yeah.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Stationers Hall, the home of the worship. It's the home of the worshipful company of stationers and newspaper makers. As I explained to some of our audience here a little earlier on, it is a grade 1 listed ancient monument. Thank you all for coming in online. Thank you all to the audience who are here tonight, live in the hall. We're aiming to raise money for our hall charity because it takes a lot of upkeep. And this is going out live all around the world on the Stationers Hall YouTube channel. So a special welcome to all of our North American members who I know are tuning in, and anybody else around the world who decided to watch us. All the proceeds from tonight will go towards the Stationers Hall charity. Special thanks to our speaker tonight, Gareth Russell, because when he knew it was for charity, he waved his use. We've also done a special deal on the books. So every time you buy a signed book tonight, we're also making a donation to charity. Gareth is an amazing character. He's a best-selling author. He's a historian, and he's a broadcaster. And the books he's written include The History of the Tudors, a lovely book about Catherine Howard. He wrote a great book about Titanic, which went down really well. All his books, the one I like best of all is on Lake Queen Mother, which is a fantastic book. And I first saw him along with Ulrika in Kensington Palace during the summer. I went along thinking, citizen of the Stuart history. And I can tell you at the end of the hour, it was the best hour's fun I've ever had. Because he's not a historian like most historians. He's absolutely full of fun and he speaks his mind. I think you're going to really enjoy it. So he will be signing books at the end. We have a few more. We do have a few more. I can sell you one of those. And look out for more lectures which are coming in the new year. We have a series of this next year. I can't tell you who's coming next because he hasn't really yet. So it will be a very, very good one. I don't think it is good as the. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big welcome to Gareth Russell.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. It is a thrill to talk about Stuart history in a so fluent. And welcome as well to everyone across the world. James has kept me fully occupied for 2 years of my life, and he was an energetic figure with sharp edges. Just as a heads up, should I look at my watch, it is not because I have become bored with you or myself, it is simply to keep track of time. The title Queen James, which is the European title in America, North America, we went for 6 Loves of James I, as my editor launched this. I love with James, I would like Americans to know that this book is as interesting and as important as the 6 Wives, which is what I'm about. So with Queen James, actually I can't take credit for that, the marketing department, which was that it is a contemporary James, like all the best jokes it was originally told. And in 1623 and 1624, we were the joke doing the wrongs at the dinner party starting in London, or Rex, Stuart, Elizabeth, and John Jacobus. We had King Elizabeth and we got Queen James. And it was supposed to be a bit of a slur on his private life and also on his foreign policy at the time. Elizabeth, despite the fact that in life she had regarded war as an absolute horror, was remembered very differently 20 years after she died as the Habsburg cropping Armada defeating Gloriana. James's refusal to get the country involved in a massive sectarian war, which coming from the north I cannot relate to. But on the 30 years war since he was called Queen James for that. Before going into this, I was very much under the impression that Queen, having its multiplicity of meanings, was a modern development. And in fact, I was swiftly disabused of that fact. The first time this Queen used to allude to homosexual activity was in the 1st century BC, when it was attached to the rising star of Julius Caesar, who aged 19 was kidnapped by King Nicodemus IV and seemed to resist rescue. quite fond of Nicky. Apparently, when he was eventually rescued and shed his Stockholm syndrome, how they would annoy him in the Senate was say that they yielded the floor to His Majesty the Queen of Bithynia, which was not the worst thing they did to Caesar in the Senate, but it was a close second, and it annoyed him very much. And James was irritated by the nickname. But one of the reasons I chose the European version was that, a little bit like actually the North American title, Six Loves of James I, which I also won, some people preferred one version or the other, and they tell them that. I have to tell them I can't with both names. So thank you, and how rude at the same time. But one of the reasons why it irritated him was that he was aware of what they were saying. James saw the world as two halves, one within the palace walls and one beyond it. And whilst he was comfortable with his private life being on relatively full display within the palace, he was genuinely quite anxious about what the impact would be beyond. But of course, he was not James the First. Most of his life, he was James the Sixth. And one of the great pleasures of this book, there were many, but one was getting to spend so much time in Scotland. And he started life in June of 1566 in a very small room in Edinburgh Castle. I've never seen a wonder how Poor Mary ever managed to give birth there. But he was quickly taken away to Stirling Castle, which is one of the most magnificent places in the country. It's genuinely extraordinary. And what historic environment Scotland had done in terms of restoring the 16th century rooms to how they would have looked at the time of the Stuarts is remarkable, and swiftly disabuses us, I think, of the idea that they were all quite sort of somber wool colours that we're used to. It was more of a welcome to Vegas in terms of the colours. James was, I think, our first great unionist, and fittingly, he had a Scottish mother and an English father. And Scotland at the time, in the 1560s, was going through a kaleidoscope of political and religious tensions. Some of them were long-standing. Gaelic was the predominant language in the north, Scots in the south, a little bit of English in the southeast. Presbyterianism had really gained a foothold among the Kirk, its leading religious authority in the south. Catholicism remained the predominant religion in the Orkneys, the Hebrides, and the Highlands. The great families loved nothing more than stabbing each other from time to time, which created its own problems. But, and sorry, I should also say, the idea of what the monarchy should be was constantly shifting. Some people wanted the Scottish monarchy to follow its European cousins and become more absolute, and to stop being so beholden to the great families. And others, particularly in Presbyterianism, were as close to a republic as you could be within the 16th century political milieu. And I don't think that James's dishy but dim father, Lord Darnley, ever quite gets the credit he deserves for being the man who united 16th century Scotland. Because whether they were Republican, Royalist, Catholic, Protestant, Lowlander, or Highlander, they all agreed Darnley must die. So when he was found half naked, strangled, running away from a detonated mansion on the outskirts of Edinburgh, it was a bit like a regal Murder of the Orient Express, and everyone had a motive. And unfortunately, there was no Poirot and a kilt to come along and solve it. But it was Darnley's suspiciously unbelieving widow, Queen Mary, who carried the can. And whilst everyone was thrilled he was dead, they were even more thrilled to pretend they were devastated by this encampment and get rid of Mary without rising. And she fled to England, where James never saw her again. The last time he saw her was at Stirling, he was 10 months old. And so this child, this 13-month-old child, becomes his Grace James VII, King of Scots and Lord of the Isles. And he's much more poem than king for most of his childhood. And the childhood, politically, is fairly uneventful, apart from seeing his grandfather shot in the back. Can't escape all of it. He does, when he's 4, see his grandfather, Lord Lennox, riding back from the gate, having been shot in the back by a rival faction. And no one is watching the child because they're so distracted by this. So Lord Lennox is the first death that he sees. There is another one that was 11 in the Great Hall at Stirling. And one of his schoolmates, a young man called Archibald Percy, is crushed to death when there's a political brawl between two factions, and one of them flips the banqueting table over and we think getting crushed. And Archibald in front of James, and there's some horrible stories of this 11-year-old child working on his there, screaming, please stop. So there are certainly a great deal of horrible things, but those are the two main political intrusions. Broadly speaking, it is kept at a distance. The protocol of the Scottish monarchy is that the king's closest male relative will hold the regency until he is of age. Somewhat unfortunately, the family tree keeps getting approved by politics. Uncle James Murray is shot through the head in the bow, and then the governor, grandfather Lennox is shot in the back, and then we have Earl, and then cousin Mar dies of stress 13 months after taking it, and finally when cousin Morton holds on to it, and that does bring peace, albeit a ticklish peace, which comes back to Scotland. At Stirling, this is sort of like the English Charlotte, it's the reflections in the mirror of the world that we So, whilst we were speaking beforehand, we talked a bit about James's grotesque childhood, and it was a story of two halves. So I always like to talk a little bit about the positives, because without them it's just so good. First, really the positives relate to James's redoubtable, thoroughly royalist governess, Mama, who sleeps in his bed till he's 10 and she picks her nephews and sons and cousins to become his classmates. They form a football team. And Stirling together, they practice archery. The Earl of Waffles is no slight, she knows the ball one day become a very active king. So he sends lots of lovely gifts like silver, threaded, blue velvet saddles for the horses that James loves, and an otter with a jeweled leash for him to walk around. He does acquire taste for exotic pets. By the time he comes to England, he is a pet armadillo. The name of which I could not discover, much to my fury, although it is a very silly job to spend 3 days hunting a dead armadillo. I would call mine Augustus, but I don't know what he calls it. And he is a physically healthy child. This idea of James is quite simply as a much liver invention, an odious person I don't want to liver. But he is taken to his manly exercises, or PE, by Lady Moore's cousins, Alan and David Erskine. This aspect of his childhood is active and healthy. But, as we know, no child who has a horrible childhood and takes on flying in the moment, and there's a big fly called George Buchanan. And I was saying earlier to Margaret that I forgot when I was talking to St Andrews, but Buchanan was sort of reflecting father and have So Buchanan is an intellectual powerhouse. He is an immensely impressive figure, one of the great Renaissance figures in Northern Europe. And he's also like a spiritual toad. He's awful. And Buchanan was a really odd choice to tutor a king, because he is, as I said, as close to republicanism as one physically can be. Politically in late 16th century Scotland. Today, it would be like the Royal Highnesses, the Prince and Princess of Wales, and Prince George, as being entrusted to someone who was not my king's son. It would just be a very unusual choice to make. And Buchanan loathes the royal family, in particular James's mother. And he spends an awful lot of time telling James how horrible his ancestors were. And one day, when James answers back, Buchanan really loses his temper. Now, there had been physical abuse before. When James's pet Sparrow died, Buchanan backhanded him repeatedly across the face because he was crying. Whatever happened in the classroom that day was so severe that really Mar, the governess, had to come in to physically probe Buchanan off him as James was screaming for help. And Buchanan flung James over to her and said, "I whipped his arse and kissed it if you want." Fortunately, Buchanan died, no one concerned. But he had really tried literally to beat into James that his job was to be the perfect avatar for Presbyterian monarchy, and that he was to be both the mirror and the light and the warning and the beacon on the hill for how his subjects were to live. And James, through a series of coups, gets himself out. As he approaches puberty, he starts to be kidnapped more often because they realize he's about to become an adult king. It'll do a little bit to your trust in humans if you're repeatedly kidnapped, including by some of your childhood friends. But James does form quite a tight coterie with other young men who he'd grown up with, and some of whom he hadn't. He met as he started in contact more often, and they, at great risk to themselves, helped plot alliances with James and some of the disaffected noble houses who backed him, emerging over cousin Morton's decapitated corpse in the 1580s to move from pawn to king at the heart of the Scottish government. But by this point, the Presbyterians in Edinburgh, where James moved to when he was about 16, 17, are starting to have some concerns about James's extracurricular activities. The first is that he's far too fond of swearing. The joke is about Baloo, or the bedroom, James loves it. He also sneaks out of the palace with one Alexander Lindsay and a group of friends to get rip-roaring drunk in Dunfermline and Edinburgh. But chief amongst their concerns are some warning shots. When he's about 13 or 14, he seems besotted with his father's cousin, the Duke of Lennox. Lennox, I do not believe, acted on that, but I think he was quite content to benefit from the Queen's adoration. The first that we can, I think, be relatively certain of is a young man called Patrick Gray. The fibre of my being when writing the book had to be wrestled into not calling the chapter on 50 Shades of Patrick Gray. Wildly unprofessional. Patrick is described as being as beautiful as Lucifer and twice as broad. He is the eldest son of an Eastern Scottish aristocratic family, so he is called the Master of Gray. His father is the fifth Lord Gray. Patrick has been spying in France and has come back almost as beautifully dressed as he is in his personage, we're told. I always feel a little bit of a caveat with Patrick, because if James had never been involved with another man, we do not have the evidence to suggest that this is what it was. However, the trajectory of his career is almost identical to the ones that we do have firm evidence for. So I always say the weight of evidence leans towards the conclusions. I don't have much time for historians to sort of force their reader towards a conclusion. You're intelligent enough to read the evidence yourself, hopefully. And Patrick, I think, is initially tolerated because it doesn't involve himself in politics, at least not. Many of us will look back on what went wrong in our first love, why did it fall apart? And we'll all probably have very similar reasons. Finding out that they'd been recruited as an English spy is probably more of a niche reason for the industry implode. But Elizabeth I figured out what was going on and recruited Patrick's silver-tongued charm. And he does not disappoint. He passes on bombshells about what James is thinking about the Lord Chancellor. He encourages the English to apply pressure to get rid of the anti-English Chancellor. The English already loathe him because the Lord Chancellor, Lord Arran, had been tasked with delivering a diamond ring to the English ambassador, and he popped the diamond out with a cheap crystal and kept the diamond for himself. And Elizabeth I, who knew a diamond when she saw it, was not pleased by this. So she was thrilled when Arran was destroyed. But Patrick is eventually destroyed when it is realised. And one thing I will always say in James's defence is that, unlike his kinsman Henry VIII, he does not have a chop and change attitude to romance or his former favourites. He tells Patrick that it might be a good idea to spend some time in France and away from me. We then move on to someone that the Presbyterian Church are absolutely horrified by before they start to miss Patrick. And that is the Earl, later the first Marquis of Huntly, who is the chief of Clan Gordon. And I was always a bit on the fence about Huntly. But Huntly does have two pieces of pretty firm evidence. One is a postscript from a letter that James sent him that I found towards the end of my research. I had to rewrite the chapter on Huntly, and another was a comment, the first time he had a clear, specific comment from a member of the royal household. So the letter that James sends to Huntly when he retreats to the Highlands is, I swear to you, that from the moment you left my side, I have not been 1 second except my own bed and scarcely even then. Which I would say, even in a society that is more expressive within the genders, that is not platonic. And even more clear is a very disgruntled Presbyterian courtier who is irked that Huntly is a man, but absolutely livid that he's a Catholic. And writes, my Lord of Huntly is a papist, but not such a devout one that he would not rather be doing such activities in a fair gentlewoman's tomb. So essentially what this gentleman is saying is, I think that Huntly has laid back and thought it wrong. And there is quite a bit of suspicion and fear amongst occur, that Huntley is going to use his beefy sexual wiles to trick James into converting to Catholicism. I cannot stress enough. Not a technique for evangelization approved of by the Vatican, but we gather our souls where we may. Huntley and James being close throughout their lives, but really the only firm evidence we have that people think that it has become something more than that is the autumn of 1587. And again, Elizabeth I interferes because she finds out that Huntley has been sending in 1588 letters of commiseration to King Philip II on the failure of the Spanish Armada. And he says, if you ever want to try again, I have deep water ports in my estate and you are welcome to use them. And Elizabeth says, you better get rid of him or you are never getting my crown. And so James does send Huntley away for a while. Huntley is said to be the second best looking man in Scottish aristocracy. And we know that because he shot and killed the first best looking man. Bonnie Earl of Murray, who during their duel departed with what I think might be the best things of London history. Possibly apart from Marie Antoinette, passively aggressively apologizing when she stepped in her executioner's foot. But it were the Earl of Murray, Bonnie Earl said to Huntley, Huntley finally spoiled a face more error than row. Which if you can go out saying, I look amazing, to shuffle off the coil. By this point, James has started a 3-year relationship with someone who I have limitless fondness for. Because anyone who's written about the 16th or 17th century will tell you how rare a duo Alexander Lindsay was, because he was just a genuine, nice person, sort of the golden retriever of the Roman nobility. And he refused to get involved in politics. He was one of the young men who risked their lives to help James in his coup in 1583. He was just a good egg. And Lord Hume, who's their mutual friend, is asked by an English guest who is Alexander Lindsay. And he couldn't quite bring himself to say it, but he used 7 words in a row, each one of which could mean that they're romantically. So in case there was any misunderstanding, he just kept saying them. And eventually Thomas, the man in question, figured out what it was. The English are concerned because they think Alexander Lindsay might become politically active. He doesn't, he touch with large. But the oldest relationship in the world, one of them, is monarchy and matrimony. And the bedrock of any 16th century society is family. And it is marriage, and it is about the peaceful transfer of power and authority. James is intellectually brilliant, and he has a remarkable mind. If you ever want to be deeply stupid, his idea of relaxing was he would take some of the Gospels of some of the early church fathers and translate them from the original Greek into Scots, and then into English, and then into French, and then back into Greek to see how well he kept up his translations. And I can do a crossword. So James did make me feel very stupid, but I am gifted with more tact than James is, which is not much. When there were protests in the streets of Edinburgh about why the 24-year-old king would not marry, when they don't want another civil war over succession, James releases a public statement that until this weekend I would have said is amongst the most tone-deaf royal statements released. But some things really are just a So James says that his much fault is found in me, that I have not yet taken a wife, and for the good of this realm I will, but as God is my witness, it sounds like a Scarlet Power, but as God is my witness, of my own nature, I could happily abstain for longer, which does nothing to quieten the rumors. With the pamphlets appearing in Scotland making fun of the brother king. And James is mildly annoyed at those. He's much more annoyed about the suggestion that he's not in full control of his government. But he does retreat for 2 weeks to a palace in the countryside and prays, and God gives him an answer, which is that he should marry the Prince of Denmark. The Presbyterians are thrilled because Denmark has offered reduction in tariffs as a part of their wedding deal, which is deeply romantic. And if you ever want to win the Presbyterians, I think you should offer them a bargain. I was brought up Presbyterian, I can say. But James decides that what he will do along with marrying Princess Anna is that he will make sure Alexander is safe, and Alexander is a younger son, so he won't have a problem. So James creates a barony for him on the day the princess arrives in Scotland, so it wasn't hugely tempting. But he also picks a wife for him, which was Jean Lyon, who died, Countess of Angus, who died voucher suggests she's much older, actually, she's really young. And Jean is Alexander's age, but she is reluctant that families to be involved in all these feuds. And James thinks if we can well them together, Alexander will be safe and well provided for. But James writes, sort of like Cyrano de Bergerac, wounds on Alexander's behalf. And he writes to Jean and says, "You are right with him. I would have thought you should have been well pleased that I am giving you this man of mine. In spite of my own bed, I have been willing to bestow upon you." I went Jean a couple of questions. But she was a game girl and got on with the marriage, and apart from sleeping with one of her neighbours, I think James marries Anna Denmark, or Anna as she's found herself in Scotland. And Anna is one of my favourite figures in the book. Not unlike James, my focus was supposed to be in the men, and I ended up unexpectedly falling a bit in love with her. She is fantastic. She would make a ruthless contestant on Traders or anywhere else. And in the 1980s, she was like a Joan Collins character, so always immaculately dressed, always plotting something. Well, to give you an idea of just how impressive Anna is, this is a little aperture into her performance. So when she arrived in Scotland, literally, she looked like Princess Aurora from Sydney Beach, a literally blonde princess. So I'm so stupid. I only know German because Mommy was German, and I only do English because and I learned a little bit of French. Scots is tricky. Cannot get my head around it. She's fluent. But that is how you hear what the servants are saying about you when they think no one can understand. So she ends up firing 3 of her ladies in living, and she won't accept them back to court until their family hands her land that she has her eyes on. She is a truly fantastic host, and she does spend a little bit too much. So when their son is born, Prince Henry, Anna wants to have a fantastic entry into the christening party, holding the baby in a chariot drawn by her pet lion. And the courtiers do point out that there's quite a bit of wiggle room on a lion might react in an enclosed hall with flaming torches. Anna thinks this is feeble, but she settles on something more minimalist, so she is wheeled in on a replica pirate ship that she has stuffed crustaceans into its cannons with a fish force and fires the monster. A window would break, but no nets. So I think that kind of is a win. The absence of evidence is not the absence of an event, but that's where I have to draw the line. All I can tell you is that James gave a real college trial, and we do not have any evidence of him falling off the wagon and onto a man for like the first decade of the marriage. When he does fall, it's dramatic. So he's found at the top of the tower with Alexander Ribbon, the strongest man in the Scottish Republic, screaming that he's trying to kill him. And it was a bit like a Christian rewrite of that chapter in the book. So there are 5 theories about what happened. But Ribbon ends up dead. And there is a scandal because people ask me times, the assassination times. You just have to use witch hunt, she's all devils after you. Could you explain why you went into this room and let Ribbon lock each door after you went, and you said no one else was to follow you? And she said, "Yes, I can explain that." And he promised that he had a crock of gold to show them. And the joking element of that was a crock of something else entirely was not long in coming. And apparently 30 years later, in Edinburgh, "Do you want to see my crock of gold?" was still a very flirtatious message. Then in 1603, just as Anna is processing where her husband's interests lie, Elizabeth I finally, from James's perspective, does the decent thing and dies, and he becomes King of England, King of Ireland, and also ruler of Wales and the Channel Islands, and also the Isle of Man. And at this point, Anne and he have done their duty. They have had several children sadly died. Robert has died of infancy, so has Princess Margaret. But they do have Prince Henry, Princess Elizabeth, and Prince Charles. There will be 2 more, Princess Mary and Princess Sophia, who, if you've gone to Westminster, I would really encourage you to see the children's. They are chin whoppers, though. They are really deeply, deeply sad. They actually had Sophia carved in her and it's a beautiful memorial of James and composed for her. But Anna by this point has figured out what James's interests are, and she says essentially, "I will give you a blank check romantically, and in return for which what I would love is a blank check." And James provides that for her. So when they arrive in England, she tries to pick out his latest squeeze so that she can control him. And she allies with Sir Robert Cecil, James's chief minister, who writes an extraordinary letter saying a beautiful man is an excellent good instrument by which to control His Majesty's good intentions. Unfortunately, the Countess of Suffolk, who issues a wake this evening, has been doing some truckling of her own. Unfortunately for us, she must have found evidence that has since vanished because she left a what does he like list for us. So it doesn't have any bad breath. They must be extremely good looking, ingredients optional. She starts to make her own sort of potions and basically curds and whey to keep their face looking youthful. So she's sort of the L'Oreal of the Jacobean court, mixed with a hint of Borgia. And they both have rival candidates, but they end up being beaten out by a Welsh chap called Lord Philip Herbert, who is apparently dishy as the day, but has the IQ of a tailor. So he's sort of 6'1", blonde, muscular, can't punch a 10 by looking at his fingers. And everyone's a little bit kind of okay with this, because Philip is very open about how stupid he is. And he says, I can't really do anything except hunt and drink and have a good time. And much as they had tolerated adultery before, the court is okay with this. He stays in the bedchamber fine. He crosses the council chamber of Denver, forms up the problem. There's a fantastic vignette of Philip quite early on in their relationship where he was cast in glittering masquerades at the Stuart court. He forgot the first little Baron's which is he must rehearse in costume and didn't. And they had sewed so many jewels onto his clothes that we're told the dance did not finish as competent as it commenced. He literally buckled onto the weight of the jewelry, which is sort of perfect metaphor for this Germanic actually. And people often ask where Elizabeth I's famous state gowns go, and Anna cut them up and used them as props to style herself for the robe. Athena, Aphrodite. Basically, if there was a goddess in the masquerade, Anna was playing it, and she would hand out Elizabeth's dresses to her favorite days and say turn those into costumes. So that's why they're all gone. When you say that to Tudor experts, you actually see a tiny blood just turning out their nose in absolute horror. Philip lasts until 1607, and he is there and absent for some of the great events of James's British reign. He has no impact on the extraordinary work James did with the authorized version of the Bible, which he is involved in. In fact, he's constantly chivvying the committees at Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster, saying, having heard you speak Greek and Latin, I cannot fault you for making poor translations. It's clear you weren't taught very well. But that's actually not what the word should mean. So he does lean in pretty heavily to make sure overseers and Ephesians becomes bishops, because he quite likes to uphold the hierarchy of the Church of England. The Fight of the Earls happens in 1607, right after the Gunpowder Plot in 1605. So he has Catholics from the north of London and Catholics fleeing Ireland and even an awful lot of land in Ulster, which he decides to fill with Protestants, which is probably better. That's how I ended up there. But I think he, although like many people in Ireland have drawn from multiple strands, but that plantation that comes in is on my mother's side actually. It's remarkable how much that was a last minute decision. And I think had they fled, say, 10 years after the government, London didn't react in the way they did. And he becomes a much more jittery figure. We start to see what we might recognize as anxiety or real problems with crowds. So there are instances where they have to talk him to come to the window to acknowledge the crowds, and he seems to be panicking. At one point, he goes behind to see the king's face, and he shouts back when I put on the britches and you should see my arse. So again, the tact isn't great. But Philip is nudged by the limelight by a young Scotsman in 1607. He's become Earl of Montgomery, or service rendered. And one of the Herbert family friends says this comment faded when we won. I think many of us in this room, all of us I would imagine, have never had Accession Day as a public holiday until late on it. The royal family would keep it very privately in February as something. Because of course it was also the anniversary of George VI's death, and likewise the current king, they did not commemorate the passing of Elizabeth II in any way but a private way of September. To give you an idea of about the death of his English predecessor. On the 24th of March every year, his accession day was marked by fireworks displays, free banquets, and a joust. So we had a different relationship. And in that joust is how he meets Robert Carr, sort of nudged off his horse, breaks his leg, and James goes to greet him. Anne doesn't get up because at this point she has never encountered an emerald, pearl, or sapphire, but she doesn't think is it better on her or near her. So movement is an absolute bare minimum. So weighs and hopes he's fine. But James starts to visit Robert when he's unwell, and he's the younger son of a Livinger family around the border area. And Robert becomes, I think, one of the great loves of James's life. And the sources that we have for it are architectural, which they redo many of the hunting lodges and countrysides that Robert suits to Robert's taste. And also there's, particularly from the end of the relationship, some really extraordinary letters. But the interior decorating is the most active Robert is for the first 3 years. And again, there's no objection. But I have to give credit to the brilliant Anne Somerset in her book Unnatural Murder about the downfall of Robert Carr, because she was the one who established that we do know that Robert had a previous same-sex relationship with a man called Thomas Overbury, who was brilliant at all. And Thomas started to use Robert as a springboard to political career by charging the great families of Court access to Robert with passive messages sent to him. When Robert changed his mind about this, Overbury threatened to blackmail him, was imprisoned in the Tower of London by a jealous James, and died of fever that turned out to be a fever accelerated by poison. Sent by Robert's ambitious Howard wife, daughter of Lady Suffolk, who had the list. So she had bought her man eventually and ended up marrying her daughter to a Soviet. So the joke in London at the time was, we dare not say why Overbury died, except he was killed from every side. And that's because Robert's wife, Frances, had poisoned tarts she sent him as get well treats, and also the apothecarist to put it in his enema when he was unwell. So it was a miracle he lasted as long as he did. By this point, as the scandal is building, suspicions are building, Anna has come to hate Robert, and she's sort of the kind of person that when you throw a pebble, she throws a grenade back. There is a response, it's never proportional. So Robert offends her at a garden party in Greenwich, and she decides to nuke his life, really. And she finds George Villiers, who the first comment everyone makes is how beautiful he is. And his family have sunk all of what is left of their money into doing the Anne Boleyn trick, which is sending him to France to come back polished and charming. Like Anne, he is very, very capable and very, very charming. Unlike her, he is not trapped with an absolute monster. And he does a lot better. But it is Anna who pushes him forward. And in one of the more unlikely alliances, Archbishop of Canterbury gets involved and trying to swear his faith. He says, but scripture tells us that to drive out one nail, you must hammer in the other one. So they start casting George in masquerades of roles of increasing importance and decreasing costume size. And we have fantastic evidence from George. So the evidence I mentioned earlier, probably the most moving things was as the relationship falls apart with Robert, James's letters to him. And he says, I beg you to show you really grabbed onto out of love and not out of greed or fear. And it is heartbreaking. And Robert, at this point, is transformed to a monster by fear. And George tries to be friendly with him. And Robert says the only service she'll ever get from me is about the break her neck, which one George, I think, has to sort of decide to see him out of court. And he is ruined by the scandal, and Anna is thrilled. And she writes letters to George, to my darling dog, just so he remembers exactly who is in control of this. Anna dies in 1619, and for the first 4 years of the relationship with George, he never does anything that will outshine her, and he is very grateful to her and to Archbishop Abbott for what they've done to him. George, from a biographer's perspective, left us an embarrassment of riches. So he is the one that we know exactly when they sat together for the first time, because he wrote to James when they had a fight, saying, I wonder, do you love me less than that first night of farming when I climbed into your bed and your bedhead was not to be found for the first time between his master and his dog. There are other things that I forgotten when I did the audiobook. I would have to say them out loud. Hands, eyes, bedposts is really the cryptos that you need. So we have filthy letters from George. We also have very affectionate letters from him. So he went on a diplomatic mission. And James wrote, "Sweetheart, this had to ride away from everyone so they would not see the tears running down my face. At the absence of you, I want nothing more in this world than to feel you once more in my arms. And I will remind you that there are historians who think they were friends." So George rises high and glitteringly so. He goes from Baron to Duke in record time. Aristocratic eyebrows are arched, stomach acid is churning. They're all very jealous. George suffers from that curse, alleged curse of extremely good-looking people, which is that no one thinks there's much going on between the years. And I did start this book with 30 dim and grim 3-year George Lewis, and that changed a little. I don't think it was completely on the side of the pages. But I will say that he was much more competent, I think, than I could give him credit for. So he's appointed Master of the Force, which is essentially Minister for Transport. He has 200 staff underneath him. He is in charge of moving the royal family from position to position, and in times of war, he has to basically stop the quarrel. So he is, he works very hard at that. He then becomes Lord High Admiral, and he brings down the cost of the movie, he increases salaries, and also the safety of the craft. The problem is, by this point, the war that I mentioned at the start has begun in Europe, and James is refusing to get involved, even though his daughter and son-in-law are very prominent in the Protestant side. And George becomes pro-war as well, and grows a beard so that he stops being prepared to believe he is a sodomite in very friendly pamphlets circulating among them. There are also plays called the Isle of Gulls, in which suspiciously homoerotic kings are played as the Spartans, but they're all played with Scottish accents. So the Globe has a bit of a nightmare as hand with the censors. James is getting more and more irate. He's also getting more and more feeble. So many of the things that we have as stereotypes of James the Druid himself, that comes from a loathsome ordeal called Sir Weldon. He hates the Scots, and it's actually making people proud of that. He's making fun of how Scottish people speak. The bow-legged and the lack of hygiene are often coming from the hunt. The leg wounds are from him drinking too much but continuing to ride the horses, and he falls off them. As he enters his 50s, they're not healing in the way they used to. There's a portrait in the book where you actually can see the angle of his ankles is pretty much permanently shifted to. And George covers it up as best he can. There's an extraordinary series of letters between them where they mention a ceremony they went through between the two of them, or marriage, they call it. James calls him my darling wife after Anne dies in 1619. George calls him my sweet husband. That's where some of the letters are a bit more expressive. Again, if you ever do an audiobook, please, I beg if you think you might have to be the one to say it out loud. On the other side of the screen going, should we just laugh at it? No, you can't. One take, that was it. So I think with George, I have more respect for him than I did going into it. George is a really tricky character because we've had same-sex lovers. I'm sure there are many bisexual and homosexual people throughout history, obviously no evidence to rise, but there are none. Whereas with Robert Howard, for instance, we do have some pretty decent evidence. So did George do what he did because of ambition? Maybe. I can't really fault him on that. The power dynamic between them was so skewed. But he also undeniably felt real affection for him. And one of the things I've been asked about structuring a book in the way that we often structure books in Henry VIII, which is through 6 marriages, or in this case 6 loves. Firstly, it's a really useful for him to buy. Secondly, as Chris said, I do often speak my mind. I have limited patience for coyness in history. You can write about people slaughtering each other, you can write about 2 men doing other things, and be frank about it. But it is not about making it an entirely new story. The joy in this is you get to weave the whole tapestry back together. You get to see all of them and all of them. And the equally important thing is that you can't fall too much into presentism and take away things that are really tricky for us. sexuality and theology are awkward bedfellows, and that's not my place to discuss it. Faith and love take people different ways. But it was very important for me to make sure that James's faith was something that I kept going through it. And so the last chapter, these 50 years, I was able to find prayers that he chose to be read as he was dying of this hunting village. And they're really moving. And it's funny, when I was reading them, my years in Sunday school came back and I found that rhythm again that we have in common. But I also was cognizant of just how, in a strange way, how lovely it was. That he died on his throne in his bed, which, if you look at the history of his family, are two quite extraordinary achievements out of prison. And he died with his son Charles holding his hand and George holding the other one and sobbing over it. And it was a series of strokes, and then just after dawn, on the 27th of March 1625, so 400 years ago, last. And he was a sharp-elbowed chap. He was not by any means perfect. Your job as a biographer, I often feel, is not to be a champion, it's just to be very popular. My sister, when she read the book, said it's awful, where somebody else really liked him. And I hope that means I've done him justice, because you'll like him if you would have liked him, you'll dislike him if you would. But he was important, and he was nuanced. And I was saying to some people I had the fortune to talk to before the talk started, that most books, when I finish them, I sort of pass them like a rugby ball as quickly as I can to my editor and say, take it away. But this one I could have kept going for another year. Such a joyful book to write. It's so interesting. And the world he lived in was so interesting. So that was Queen James, or Crown of North America, The Six Loves of James I. Was thus far one of the happiest books I've written, even though most people ended up quite starved about it. But as Chris said, I've written about the Titanic, so this doesn't seem quite happy. I know our body count, but that was the James I came to know as in the real Gareth through his life. But thank you very much for listening, and I'll take some questions if anyone has them. Yes, shall I pass the mic to someone, or Joyce to repeat the question? There we go.
So bit about your and was there a moment when oh my goodness, and then you talked about how your sister.
Yes. Great. So the first question is on sources. They're scattered. So actually, some of them have been hidden inside the National Library and the National Archives for years. They just weren't included in the published editions of his letters in the 19th century and 1950s because they were felt to violate public decency. So some of them were there. Some of them are in private collections. So there's wonderful houses in Scotland, also places body and some half the world. They're scattered. So going to these places is not an onerous task. Yes, there was the postscript to Huntley's, the one that I had in my aha, because it was the first. I had suspected that Huntley was a bit too both and didn't have an argument on it, but then to have that postscript coupled with what the reviewer said was an aha moment. There also was a little bit towards the end where I had a very strict criteria for who I could say was and wasn't. And at the very end, I was like, oh, you and Hay, huh? So I hadn't realised him and James Hay had a bit of a thing until the very end. And what did I think of them? Sometimes I'm asked who I'm most like to go out for a drink with. Who I've written about. So would be mother. But part of thinking her and I would keep kids with each other. But I would go out with James if it's no like if they're at the pub, because I don't need the one drink in a person. I think you need five. I was impressed by him. Sharp, as I say, but the commitment piece, and bringing up a remarkable thing he said about pressure on the war. And he said everyone hates him enough. There are thousands of mothers with their children getting and well, actually, that's a remarkable thing. So some members would like to impress, but not. So,
George Villiers,
yes.
Buckingham,
Yes.
became universally hated.
Yes.
Why was he so unpopular, and to what extent was public opinion important in how the king saw him, and what, I mean,
what happened? Great question. So it's why did Buckingham become so unpopular and high in public opinion and the relationship? So in many ways, he's hit by the curse of the royal favourite with advisor throughout history, which is that people are either jealous or annoyed and they can be everything on him. And also generally, sometimes extreme good looks can carry with them a burden that people don't react well to, which is touching. The public opinion thing is very interesting because there's a massive movement in Parliament to impeach him. James writes to him and says, I would rather live banished poverty with really any part of the world than rule his life through the world. So he was prepared to face on massive public disapproval of the relationship. It is very much assumed in London that George became a secret. George, through his charm with friends, James's son Charles I survives into that, and he's still loved. I mean, part of it is that there was not nothing compared to the rest of the population, but compared to the great families, they come from nothing and suddenly they're everything. So I do think there's a cauldron of reasons. But one thing I would say from James is, apart from he's 23, 24, and he gives up Alexander Lindsay in order to appease public pressure to get married, he doesn't do it again. It's always a misunderstanding, which I quite like. Yes, sir.
Is it that James Lindsay's wife?
Yes.
Why did Charles first get along with Charles' mother? They even went on holiday together.
So one of the eternal truths is that we never ask many questions about parents' sex lives. So I think Charles was don't ask, don't tell. And there is a letter from him where he seems to come pretty close. And he says, if you're not by his side, take the joy of the day. I think Charles kind of put it to the back of his mind. I mean, somehow George is like his stepmother who befriends him. And George is charming personified. And I don't think Charles wanted to think about it. There are moments, as I say, in the letters where you can see that he is aware it's a very intense relationship, but I wouldn't blame a 17 or 18-year-old. They're friends. Yes, they are often all together, but my dad and my best friend are just friends. Yeah, that was a tough one for Charles, actually. When you say the sentence like that's a tricky one to get your head around. But Charles either didn't believe it or chose not to look at the evidence. I think that was it. And George does around, I'd say around 1620, 1621, George makes a very conscious effort to befriend Charles and charm him, because he knows that James is mortal and finite, and all favourites are thrown out of the rubbish. So I think it's a charm offensive, really. In a nutshell, that's what it is. And Charles is not willing to look, and George is willing to start. Thank you very much.
Really enjoyed the great deal of the talk.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about a specific story back.
Yes.
I recently bought a book by Mel Lamb
Yes.
called Forbidden Desire.
Yes.
Yeah, you know. So about the relationship between James and George. He basically said, well, jolly good chance.
Yes.
As far as I know, nobody suggested that I'm playing with Paul and Jane Shaw, which is jolly good chance.
No.
My way of it. But even in contemporary stories, I mean, 11 years after their marriage,
Yeah.
just seem to have the most, they'd rather pull out their own teeth than just look at the end and say, yeah, of course, this is a
Well,
why is that?
I don't know, actually. I was next to Noel in the archives yesterday, and we didn't realise who we were until we left. But, very good book. It is a very good book. It's an excellent book. It's a massive academic history of same-sex intimacy between 1450 and 1750. You would have to ask Noel that, because one thing I would say is it's a huge undertaking, and it is a vast panoramic history of same-sex intimacy in the early modern period. I hope it's not unduly rude of me to suggest that I would imagine, because it wasn't focusing really on James, he probably is basing on a secondary account. That would be my instinct. He's an excellent historian. That was a somewhat surprising conclusion. But there's a long history as to why that is. So James is really written off as a degenerate, foolish, grotesque king. And when the Victorians turned to rehabilitate him, and they do, I mean, they do extraordinary work in the archives, and any historian should be grateful to them. The Victorians get a bit of a hard knock in terms of their contribution to historiography. Between that and the 1960s, I would say, there is no way that you can defend someone where homosexuality is present. It's a psychological disease. And so they withhold the evidence, and then the printed sources endure so much that people haven't seen them, they're overlooked. What I will say that is quite interesting about his reputation is that it actually did move further forward than we thought. So in the 1980s, an excellent historian who sadly passed away not too long ago, Roger Lockyer, wrote an academic biography of him, and he was the first to include that letter where Buckingham specifies bending sex abuse. And Lockyer sort of carried the day. If you look at books written by James in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they accept it. They accept he was part of Buckingham. And then the shutters came down, thanks to a brilliant but complex gay historian, in an instance of friendly fire, called Alan Gray. And he was an extraordinary scholar of the Renaissance and a very, very devout Christian, interested in evangelicalism, and he struggled with reconciling those two sides of the group. And he wrote a book called The Thread, in which he went through men being buried in the same coffin or in the same tomb, or their hands being intertwined. And he said that does not mean it's sexual. And his, like Jacob with God in the wilderness, I think he was wrestling with the state of his whole life. And the book, it's a terrible saying this because Alan Gray then did tragically die in the AIDS epidemic, but he it seems into a service. It was a brilliant mind and tortuous soul coming together to write something that I think is personal and children. And because it was so persuasive, and I do think part of the work people wanted here, it shifted, and we're still, it's not just James. I mean, sometimes you have letters like the saucy ones from George, where people are like, oh, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's a cat. Yeah, no, it's not, and also this is my mention out of the book of Jim Shore. This is, I have to be so like, it's like being a mother, you just have to smile sometimes. I don't know the Wallace. And the incident that really gets me is Henry and Mary Grant, which is just uniformly accepted, and there are 3 sentences. So what we will allow for evidence and not allow is a little frustrating. At the same time, you have to put your good boy pants on sometimes and accept that if you're writing about something a bit new, people like yourself are completely entitled to answer those questions. And it is new, and you can't be prickly about the questions. You can be prickly when people say something that's bullish. But what I include in the book is an appendix at the end where I talk about how we deal with this evidence. And also what terms do we use? Do we use homosexual, do we use sodomy, buggery, do we use gay, what's bisexual? So I talk a little bit about that because I think as a historian you have to be willing. You can't take it personally. I don't want to ask the question. The history of same-sex intimacy isn't any more sacred than any other history. It's just it's new. It's how to fight what it's like. So yeah, it's baffling sometimes, but other times they are very valid and important questions to listen. Thank you. So we have time for just one more. Yes.
You mentioned how much you enjoy your time in Scotland.
Yes.
You have a King James who you can recommend or enjoy to ride with the North 500?
Oh, yeah, I mean, listen, so I previously was doing content before, but at one point I have to remind myself how good they could be to me. Because every time someone asks me what my favorite historic poem was, like, Sterling! which it is Hampton Court. But, so if you're looking for, first of all, I can't recommend Sterling enough, it really is beautiful. Some great B&Bs in town. The Lithgow is beautiful, but do you know this? The next sentence covers all of Scotland for me. Because there's no roof on the Lithgow. Falkland is extraordinary. Hollywood House is lovely, although it's had quite a bit done to it. If you ever want to figure out just how much the royal family, like Scotland, is their favourite child, get the audio guide at Hollywood House. Because usually you have like the standard, the bottom dressing listen, and sometimes they'll get as an extra treat a historian or an expert. Princess Anne and Prince Edward, they're the Princess Anne says, well, you know, the thing about Hollywood is it's a real palace. It's not, essentially she, in 30 sentences, finds a way not to say, I hate Buckingham Palace, if that makes sense. And then Prince Edward comes in and he says, you know, this is when it feels like a home. And I said, why don't you just admit you all hate Buckingham Palace? But anyway, Hollywood House is wonderful and still a really working palace, which I think makes a difference to me anyway. I think homes that are lived in have a warmer air than ones that are just scenes. Oh, when you're at Stirling, you can contact the local tourist board. Stirling Tourist, because they close the Holy, the curve of the Holy Road, which is right next to it. But if you're interested and want to go, they will go in the winter months. It's where it's crowned. It's a little bit crown. They kind of nudged the crown against his head because he was smaller than it. And then they sort of tapped him with the scepter and the honours of Scotland. But they're in Edinburgh Castle. Edinburgh Castle, strangely, is the one I probably felt the least, partly because so much of it has changed and didn't really spend a lot of time there. In England, there's a fantastic statue of him outside the Bodleian Library in the quadrangle, and he said he wasn't a king. His desire in life would be to be a professor at Oxford, so take that English. And also on Portsmouth, the Great Hall, where he held court, Christmas Square 1630, is everyone's a Shakespeare lover. It is the place that we know, the only place that we know that he performed. So he rehearsed the back and they performed multiple plays in the Great Hall, including Death, which they kept really short because the King of Denmark was living in life drink. Somewhere around Act 3, King Christian got so drunk that he fell off the dais. Also, if you had another Shakespeare lover, say, Elsinore in Hamlet was the singer where James and Hans spent their honeymoon. So that's why that's it. Yeah, Hampton Court, and then Westminster Abbey. Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's a real pleasure.
How about that, ladies and gentlemen? Have you been to a history lecture before? You've seen somebody go through his entire book without notes, not looking at anything, there were no slides, it's all in his head, and that was an expurgating version. There is a slightly ruder we have there as well. But let's have one more round of applause for our brilliant